In this section, I'm going to go over shutter speed. What the shutter speed controls in my words. It controls how the motion will look in a picture. It also controls how much light you will let in your camera. It also will control how sharp your pictures will be. If you want to freeze motion in your images, shoot at a faster shutter speed. The faster the shutter speed, the higher the number. Depending on what lens you are using, you should be shooting no lower than a 300 to 500 shutter speed to actually freeze motion really good and not get any motion blur in the movements. For the jumping in the air pictures, the higher the shutter you can shoot, the better. If you want motion blur, shoot at a very slow shutter speed. The slower the shutter speed, the lower the number. When you want to capture the sparkler picture that you can see the light from the sparkler dragging in the image, that is motion blur. To get motion blur like this, you need a super slow shutter speed. The slower the shutter speed, the better. You should be shooting at a 1 second shutter speed to start to get good motion blur. You can hand hold this, but the image will be very blurry, not sharp. You will need a tripod to get a less of a blurry picture. And I am not referring to the motion blur, I am referring to the picture not being sharp as far as the actual subject. I notice in the complete dark you can hand hold your camera and just see the sparkler shapes and not notice too much blur in the whole image since the background will be black. But if you are doing this with any light outside and you can see your subject, definitely use a tripod. The faster the shutter speed you use will make your images look sharper than using a slower shutter speed. I don't mean that you have to shoot at a 500 shutter speed every time to have the sharpest images. For moving subjects personally, I try not to go under a 200 shutter speed if it is possible. I know certain situations you need more light, so it isn't always possible to stay 200 and above. I notice if you stay above 200 shutter speed, you can almost always get really sharp images with every picture. I have had to shoot at around 125 and 80 if I really need to. It is not impossible to get sharp images, but not every image will be super sharp shooting at a slower shutter speed. Understanding how shutter speed affects your exposure. The faster the shutter speed, the less light you are letting in your camera. The slower the shutter speed, the more light you are letting in your camera. Certain lenses will require a certain shutter speed to get the sharpest images and to prevent showing camera shake. You can base your shutter speed on what lens you are using and what look you are going for. If you are using a shorter focal length lens, such as a 35mm or a 50mm lens, try not to go under 200 shutter speed, especially when shooting children because they move around a lot. If you don't pick a fast enough shutter speed, you will not get the sharpest images possible. When you are using a longer focal length lens, such as a 70x200, try not to go under a 400 shutter speed if it is possible. This lens is pretty heavy and can make you get some camera shake, so to not let the camera shake affect your picture, you want to shoot at a really fast shutter speed to get the sharpest images possible. This is an example of freezing the motion. My settings were aperture was a 6.3, shutter speed was a 400, ISO was a 200. And as you can see that there is no motion blur. If you don't pick the right shutter speed, even if it is a high number, but not a high enough number, you can see some motion blur in their hands or their feet when you're doing the jumping picture. So as you can tell with this one, his hands and his feet are completely froze. Because I have noticed sometimes when you're doing the jumping picture, if you don't shoot at a high enough shutter speed, when their hands are moving or their feet are moving, you can sometimes see the motion blur really good in their hands and feet. You won't really see it much in their face, but I've noticed the hands and the feet are where you can tell the most. So it's definitely important to make sure that you are picking the correct shutter speed when you want to freeze the motion.